In the fall of 1953, Norman Dodd, who at that time was the chief investigator for the Reese Committee to Investigate Foundations, a committee of the United States Congress that had been set up to look into what the tax-free foundations were doing. There was some suspicion among the American public because of some of the strange places they were putting their grant money. Norman Dodd was summoned to the office of H. Rowan Gaither, then head of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither basically asked him, he wanted to know why the Congress wanted to investigate the foundations. And Mr. Dodd briefly explained that there was some concern about the direction that they were headed with their grant-making power. And Mr. Gaither very candidly said that the foundations have been operating under directives issued by the White House, the substance of which is that we are to use our grant-making powers to so alter life in the United States that it might someday be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Well, you can imagine that just about bowled Mr. Dodd over. When he recovered from his state of shock, he said, "Would you please come to Washington and state that before the entire committee so that it can be a matter of public record?" And Mr. Gaither responded by saying, "That we would not think of doing." Today, we see the same foundations, the Ford Foundation and others, and the same group of elitists working to change life in the United States. Well, they've been working at that for a number of years, and today they're working specifically not only to change the socio-economic makeup of our country, and that indeed would be a topic for a speech all to itself, but today they're working to change the structure of government under which we live. They formed an organization, and I'll elaborate as to who the they is that I'm referring to, but for now, suffice it to be they. They formed an organization called the Committee on the Constitutional System, the CCS. And they've published a book entitled Reforming American Government, and they've laid out a long-term strategy for changing the structure of the United States government, to convert us basically from the constitutional republic that our founding fathers gave us, with a system of separation of powers, checks and balances, and liberty for the people, to a European-style parliamentary form of government with the abolition of the separation of powers and a drastic concentration of power into the executive branch of government. Now, this is one particular book that they've published. They are working on others, and they've published others. This one entitled Reforming American Government, the bicentennial papers of the Committee on the Constitutional System, lays out their basic plan. It lays out the specific changes and recommendations, their criticisms for our current system. And if you turn to page XVI, the Roman numeral section, at the bottom it says, financial support has come from the Ford Foundation, the Brookings Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation. Support of the committee's work as a whole has been provided by the Dillon Fund and the Hewlett and American Express Foundations, and by the contributions of its members. Now, I'd like to point out that there are, if you look at the members of the Board of Directors of the Committee on the Constitutional System, it looks like a who's who in America. And one of the members of their board is a man named James L. Sundquist. He's written a book entitled Constitutional Reform and Effective Government. And it again is a criticism of our current system of government with proposals almost identical to the proposals in reforming American government. In fact, there are quite a collection of authors, all affiliated with this same organization, that have written books of their own. This particular book was published by the Brookings Institution, I should say. It also has a little expression of appreciation at the end of the introduction. It says, the Brookings Institution deeply appreciates financial assistance for this study from the American Express Foundation, the Dillon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, there's a neat little package there, because if you look into the members of the Board of Directors, for example, of the Brookings Institute, you'll find that of the 54 directors, 32 of them, that's more than half, and this is their list, I doubt that you can see it back there, but I've marked them off. 32 of the 54 are members of an organization called the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, this is an organization that we feel is working for a one-world superstate. Now, if you were to take a look at the board of directors of the Committee on the Constitutional System, and again, I've marked them off. This is their list. You have a total of 41 board members. 16 of them are members. Just a little less than 40% are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So what you've got is a collection of organizations made up of very influential people that are working to so alter life in the United States that it might literally be comfortably merged into a world superstate. Now, as we look to the news recently, look at recent events, you look at all that's happening in Western Europe, we're being told that the Cold War is over, that we won, communism's dead, etc., etc. In 1984, a Soviet defector, a colonel in the KGB, named Golitsyn, wrote a book entitled New Lies for Old. And in that book, he laid out exactly what we are seeing happen today. He even predicted the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, the purges of the old line leaders in Eastern Europe, people such as Ceausescu and others. And he pointed out that it was a long-term strategy that the Soviets had been working on for some time. The purpose was to further convince the people in the West that communism was mellowing and was no longer an enemy, and to facilitate the leaders in the West efforts to provide billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayers' funds to provide high technology, credit, equipment, etc. If you look at the news, you'll find that Congress has recently passed very large appropriations for various countries in Eastern Europe. If you listen to President Bush's recent Thanksgiving Day speech, personally one of the most frightening speeches I've ever heard. If you know how to read between the lines, throughout his speech he was talking about the progress we're making toward what these folks refer to as their New World Order. And he used those words. He talked about the emerging order, bringing the Soviet Union into the world order, etc., etc. Called for funding for Eastern Europe. And what we're seeing is simply a change of leadership there. We are seeing a form of government which has basically been an oligarchy, a totalitarian system, replaced with new individuals with new slogans and the same old oligarchy. The people that run the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, the Committee on the Constitutional System are working for just such a system for the United States of America. Now, if these were just a group of radicals, some college radicals, it would make little difference. But when you look at the board of directors of this organization, it reads like a who's who in America. You've got former congressmen, former senators, former governors, the co-chairperson of the Republican National Committee, the head of the Democratic National Committee, so you've got what Tom Anderson used to refer to as bipartisan treason here. We can't blame it on the Democrats or the Republicans. Union leaders like Glenn Watts, President of Communication Workers of America, the former governor, current U.S. Attorney General, Dick Thornburgh, and these people are deadly serious about their proposals. Now, they're not naive. These men are all men who have experienced political success, personal success. They've accumulated wealth in most cases. And they know that simply writing books and making proposals is not going to bring about their changes. They know that in order to implement the changes they want, it's going to take a crisis. And they basically make no bones about that. In the various books, they state rather clearly that without a crisis, there can be no change. In fact, James McGregor Burns likes to use the word an igniting crisis. That's easy for me to remember. I just think Burns ignites. So James McGregor Burns has uses the term repeatedly. I was just skimming through the book, came across it at least 24 times on the plane flying up here, where he uses the term igniting crisis. They talk about the fact that they could not get their package of changes through without a serious crisis. They talk about something equivalent to the Depression of the 1930s. To give you a couple of specific examples, Dick Thornburgh, writing on pages 27, 28, and 29 of Reforming American Government, that's this particular book. He's the U.S. Attorney General. He says, quote, "Today the question is whether we can continue to afford the luxury of the separation of power in Washington between the executive and legislative branches of our government. You may ask, what is the alternative? The answer could well be some form of parliamentary democracy. Such a significant shift in our Constitution is unlikely to come about except as a result of a crisis, a depression comparable to that of the 30s. Now, I think it's pretty clear what he's talking about there. They also make it clear that what they want here is a complete departure from the form of government that we enjoy and that has given us freedom and prosperity for the last 200 years. In both The Power to Lead by James McGregor Burns and in Reforming American Government, James McGregor Burns writes, quote, "Let us face reality. The framers of the Constitution have simply been too shrewd for us. They have outwitted us. They designed separate institutions that cannot be unified by mechanical linkages, frail bridges, tinkering. If we are to turn the founders upside down, to put together what they put asunder, we must directly confront the constitutional structure they erected." Now let's just take a couple of moments to briefly talk about that constitutional structure. And hopefully everybody in here is somewhat familiar with it. If you're not, we have copies of the United States Constitution on the back of the table, and the John Birch Society was put together for the purpose of educating people about their Constitution and this wonderful form of government that we have. But let me just point out that our founding fathers were emphatic that they wanted a separation of powers. James Madison said that the accumulation of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers into one hand was the very definition of the word tyranny. And some argue that indeed having a separated, fragmented government with different powers and different branches and what have you is inefficient. And that's probably true. It is inefficient. Dictatorship is much more efficient at making decisions and carrying out orders. You may recall that Mussolini promised that if the people of Italy would make him the dictator, he'd make the trains run on time. And he did. The people of Italy paid for it with their freedom and a whole lot more, but the trains ran on time. That is not the kind of efficiency that our founding fathers wanted, and that's not the kind that we need in this country. Our system of government was set up based on principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence. Our founding fathers stated that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, your rights come from Almighty God. It goes on to say that governments are instituted among men to protect those rights. And then they put together a government that was designed to keep the concentration of power out of any one hand. They set up a system of government where members of the legislative branch could not serve in the executive branch. They intentionally put together elections scheduled so that they would not coordinate. In other words, you've got congressional elections coming up every 2 years, senatorial elections every 6 years, presidential elections every 4 years. And it was felt, in fact, James Madison said that one of the keys to free government was frequency of elections. In other words, the fact that the congressmen come up every 2 years. Now back then, you go back into the 1700s, elections were a difficult, tedious process, and to have one every 24 months was, people complain about the expense today, but it was a whole lot more difficult at that point in time. But it was one way of keeping that branch of government, the U.S. House of Representatives, that's accountable to the public, that's accountable to you and I, keeping their feet to the fire and keeping them accountable. So basically we were set up with a system that fragmented that power and guaranteed our freedoms. The CCS proposals, however, that are outlined in this book are quite different. They're totally different. Just to hit a few of them, they are all designed to concentrate power into the executive branch of government. And you might want to keep that in mind. Some people call that dictatorship, some people call that oligarchy, but the bottom line is a loss of freedom. And what it will effectively do is to remove your voice from government. Now let me just run down through a few of their proposals and explain how they will have an effect on you. The first thing that they've proposed is lengthening the terms of office. They want to lengthen the term of office for senators to 8 years. Golly, the guys hardly write to us now. You know, you write to them now, they wait for 5.5 years, and then they start answering your letters. You stretch it out to 8 years, and you'll never hear from them again. And lengthening the House of Representatives' term of office to 4 years. Now, on top of this, and bear in mind it was Madison that said frequency of elections is the cornerstone of free government. Doesn't sound like we're doing anything to strengthen that cornerstone. But on top of that, they want to have coordinated terms of office. In other words, the presidential elections would coincide with congressional elections every time and the senatorial elections. In other words, every 8 years you'd have both a, let's say you'd have a congressional election, a senatorial election, and a presidential election. Now, in addition to that, they've proposed an amendment to the Constitution that would require a slate or team ballot. In other words, just as today you cannot vote for a Republican for president and a Democrat for vice president or some other third party, they want to make it a requirement that you could only vote party and not individual. In other words, if you voted for a Republican president, you'd get a Republican senator and a Republican representative. Now, their arguments are that this would strengthen the executive branch of government, and I guarantee you it would strengthen the executive branch of government. Their proposals will do exactly what they're proposing and a whole lot more. Because what this would mean would be that any president, in order to win, would already have a majority in the House and Senate going in with him, just by the very process of winning the election. But apparently they're not confident that even that would be enough. Perhaps they foresee some time down the road when you might have 3 or 4 parties, and a president could win with a minority, or let's say fewer than half of the votes, so that he could have a majority of the votes, but not have enough to carry a majority of the House and Senate. So what they've proposed additionally is bonus seats in the House and in the Senate. They've proposed, for example, that 50 Senate seats would be filled by appointment by the party winning, in other words, the party in power. Now, what we're describing here, ultimately, while it is a strengthening of the executive branch, and the executive branch would become the vehicle for executing power, it would actually be party politics. What I'm saying is it would be strengthening a party system. You'd have a party system, just as you have in some European countries, and just as you have in a very real sense in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party runs the government. They may have a front man named Gorbachev or Khrushchev or Stalin or some other person, but the party makes the decisions. The power is in the hands of the party, and this is the expressed desire in the reforming American government, the power to lead, constitutional reform and effective government. They all talk about the importance of strengthening the party structure. Now, additionally, they would give the power to have legislators in the executive branch of government. In fact, it would require that a certain number of congressmen and senators serve in the president's cabinet. Now that today is specifically forbidden by the U.S. Constitution. And I like their term, because the term has kind of an interesting ring to it. They use the term in all 3 books. They say it would bring about closer collaboration. Somehow collaboration, well, it's not an evil term in itself, just has a certain ring that I think is very appropriate. They would also give the president the power to dissolve the Congress and to call for new federal elections. Representatives to try to change the direction. The president could kick them all out. They want to change the control of the major cities from the states to the federal government. This is something that sounds pretty exciting to the mayor of Philadelphia at this point. They've got a debt of more than $29 million, and they're right now in a death spiral financially. And it looks as though even the state of Pennsylvania is not adequate to bail them out, and they're talking about massive federal aid. They have another proposal, another proposed constitutional amendment that would severely limit campaign spending. Now that may sound like a pretty good idea on the surface, but when we talk about things like political campaigns, that is the ultimate exercise of your freedom of speech. Now, you know, we think about slippery politicians and buying votes and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, your ability to influence the political process is dependent upon your freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is dependent upon financing. When we put out these trim bulletins, I tossed one up here somewhere, here it is, it costs money. It costs money for the paper and the ink. And these things have an influence. We don't have freedom of speech if someone can tell us where we can get or how we can spend the money for these trim bulletins. Now, a few years ago, trim was so terribly effective that a number of congressmen got together and persuaded the Federal Election Commission to bring suit against us to try to shut us down. And the basis for that suit was that we were violating federal election laws and that we were not reporting all of our campaign spending to the federal government, that we had not given them a detailed accounting of where every penny came from, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we took our case to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won. It's one of these situations where when you are attacked by the federal government, when you're sued by the federal government, you lose no matter what. We won. As you can see, we still have trim bulletins, and we've maintained our right. But the cost of defending ourselves was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The cost of prosecuting us was even more, but we, the taxpayers, picked that up, so no one's very much concerned. Now, I think you can see that if they can use that type of lever to shut down distribution of a report card on your congressman, they can use the same type of lever to control campaigning of a congressman. Well, let's go further. They're not content with that. They not only want to limit the campaign spending, but they want to have you and I, the taxpayers, pick up the tab for it, so that the campaigns would be financed for the House and the Senate by the taxpayers. But half of the money would be given not to the candidates, but to the Democratic and Republican national committees. Now, you may think, well, gee, that doesn't mean much. Well, let me tell you. I live in the state of Pennsylvania, and Dick Thornburgh, who's now proposing that we rewrite the U.S. Constitution, had a hand a number of years ago, before he was governor, in rewriting the Pennsylvania state constitution. And there's a little provision in there that allows the party leadership of the Democratic and Republican Party to control the funding for the offices and office staff and supplies, etc., of the members of the legislature. Now, that doesn't seem like anything very significant. If they put it on the ballot, the average person probably wouldn't even understand what it meant if they read it. But the net result is, when we go to Pennsylvania legislators and we ask them to do things like propose a bill to withdraw Pennsylvania's call for a constitutional convention, they inform us that if they buck party leadership, the funding for their office staff is cut. And the party has the power to hire and fire their office staff and to select who works for them. Now, if you don't think that is not a disciplinary measure that'll keep a representative in line and in tune with what the party bosses want, what the power brokers want, rather than what the people want, all you have to do is try to get something through in Pennsylvania, and you'll see exactly what that has. In fact, the very words that they use in reforming American government is party discipline. They say that it will strengthen party discipline. Now, I mentioned that a lot of people think of the Soviet Union as a dictatorship, but what it is in reality is an oligarchy. An oligarchy is ruled by man, where man, a small elite group of men, have no real limits on their power. What we're talking about is creating a situation where a handful of party power brokers will decide what happens in the government, and you, as an individual, can protest, you can write, you can do letters to the editor, you can do anything you want, but it's not going to have a significant effect. Now, you may look around and say, well, gee, is it all that different today? Maybe, in fact, because not enough people put forth an effort to change things, it may seem that way now. But if you look at your Constitution, you have tremendous power. If you look at the results that the trim committees have gotten around the country, and you don't have to travel halfway across the country, just go a little bit north of here. You remember a few years ago there was a congressman named Pattison that represented the area up toward Lake George and what have you. We flooded that area with trim bulletins. I say we. I'm a Bircher and a trim member. I wasn't involved in that particular activity. Some of you in the room tonight were involved. But they flooded the area with trim bulletins. The voters got a good look at what Pattison was doing. They threw him out on his ear and replaced him with Jerry Solomon. That kind of thing has happened all over the country. You do have a voice now. If these changes go through, you will not have a voice. And this is why you see the frustration of the people in Eastern Europe and in parts of Western Europe. But you see, the world would then be basically much closer aligned much more closely aligned, because we would have a system similar to what they have. One of the final proposals that I mentioned, and this is not all of them, well, let me rattle through a couple more. They want to reduce the numbers needed to eliminate the Senate's ability to block treaties. They want to reduce the numbers and spread it out to both houses. Now, the reason stated is that we live in an interdependent world, and in this rapidly changing world, the president needs to be able to negotiate without being hampered by the U.S. Senate and public backlash against his treaties. You may remember the knockdown, drag-out battle over the Panama Canal treaties. You may remember that SALT II, which was negotiated by one of the founders of the CCS, was knocked down completely, was never ratified because of public pressure on the United States Senate. So you may think that things are a little hopeless now. You may think, well, gee, it's so bad now, how can it be any worse? Well, it could be a whole lot worse, because if you care, you can have an influence today. If you let this go through, you can write it off. Your influence will be gone. Now, these are some of the specific proposals. And again, I have to emphasize, they are not so naive as to think that they can simply propose these at a constitutional convention, they'll breeze right through, and they'll be on the road to New World Order. They are not that naive. They talk over and over again in all their literature about the absolute necessity of a crisis. For example, on page 273 of A New Constitution Now, they state, if the state legislatures could be brought to act under the present Constitution, they could take a great step forward immediately, but they would be likely to act only if public opinion reached a critical stage. And in every piece of literature that they write, they emphasize over and over again that they need a crisis. They must have a crisis. Well, how difficult would it be to experience a crisis in the United States of America today? You consider the fact that we are spending so wildly that today we have to borrow money to pay the interest on the borrowed money. We look at a national budget that when Jimmy Carter went out of office was $900 and some odd billion. A few short years later it was over $1 trillion, and then $2 trillion, and now is racing on past the $3 trillion mark. Now that is the official borrowed portion of the national debt. That does not include unfunded liabilities and their little shell game that they're playing with the Social Security Trust Fund. I'm sure all of you that work know that as of the first of the year, your Social Security contributions were increased. And what they do, they take the money and they put it into a Social Security Trust Fund. Then the federal government borrows the money out of the trust fund to use for the current obligations. But they, for some strange reason, some strange magic of bookkeeping, don't count that as part of the national debt. They take and print up some pieces of paper called bonds, and they stuff them in there and say, oh, now these, it's covered by these bonds, it's good. The bottom line is, if you take all these obligations, the national debt is in excess of $17 trillion and growing rapidly. Now, when you look at a situation like that, it is not difficult to imagine an economic crisis that would make the Depression of the 30s look like child's play. So, what is their strategy? Their strategy is first to get a constitutional convention called. Now, they know, again, there is no popular consensus, not from liberals, not from conservatives, not from moderates. Nobody wants a constitutional convention, particularly. Nobody wants the Constitution rewritten. So how do you get a constitutional convention called? Well, you look for any good idea that you can come up with. Now, I'm not talking about bad ideas. I'm not talking about things that would upset people. I'm talking about things like a balanced budget amendment, things like a right-to-life amendment, things of that sort, things that people are likely, an amendment to prevent burning the United States flag, the flag of our wonderful nation. Now, I've got pictures of 3 books. 2 of the books I have on the table, one of them I don't. One of them is entitled A New Constitution Now. It's written by a man named Henry Hazlitt. Mr. Henry Hazlitt, interestingly, is on the board of advisors of a group called the National Taxpayers Union. Now, the National Taxpayers Union is the group that has been most successful in pushing the call for a constitutional convention. And they have persuaded 32 of the required 34 states to issue calls for a constitutional convention. That's how close we are, within 2 states. Now, I'm going to elaborate on that and change those numbers a little bit on you at the end of the talk, but you'll understand why at the time. Now, their argument, the National Taxpayers Union, they say, all we want is a balanced budget amendment and nothing else. We want a limited convention limited strictly to balancing the federal budget. We can call such a convention to propose a specific amendment. It wouldn't go any further. Well, Henry Hazlitt, who's a member of their Board of Advisors, has written a book entitled A New Constitution Now, and in this book, he explains the strategy for calling a convention for any purpose. He said, come up with the best purpose you can and push it, any purpose, and then, once the convention's open, you can do anything you please. In fact, he talks on page 271, he says, in the same way, an amendment to the Constitution could be proposed that would strike out everything after the paragraph, we the people do ordain and establish this Constitution. I want to elaborate on this point. Can you or can you not limit a constitutional convention to one subject? It's extremely important, because at the end of the evening, I'm going to ask all of you to call, write, and visit your state senators and state representatives here in Albany to ask them to stop the call for a constitutional convention from being issued. New York is one of the few states that has not yet issued a call. Those states are far more critical than the states that have already issued a call. In Pennsylvania, we're trying to get a call withdrawn, and in other places. But it's much more important that in New York, you stop any fresh call. So when you go to talk to these representatives, they're going to say, well, listen, I only support a limited constitutional convention call to balance the budget. And they can bring out a frightening array of statistics, virtually all of which are accurate, to scare the daylights out of anybody, convincing them that we need to get a handle on Congress, a handle on the federal spending. And they're all valid figures. The point is, the Constitutional Convention is not intended to do that. Now, let me just hit a couple of points on the Constitutional Convention. The first thing you need to do is to read the Constitution. Now, I'm just going to take a moment and take a look at Article 5. That is the amending article. It reads as follows. The Congress, comma, very important, remember that, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, plural, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. And it goes on talking about some things that are obsolete here, but that's the heart of it. Now, the operative word here is the Congress. The Congress, comma, everything else follows after that. The Congress is empowered to call the convention. The Congress is empowered to decide how the things are going to be ratified. Now, the reason I emphasize that is because the NTU tells us that Congress is out of control, and that we need to control Congress by calling a constitutional convention. That's like saying the foxes are decimating the flock. We've got to put them in the hen house. Now, let me point out that historically speaking, when the first Constitutional Convention was called, it was called to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. That was all it was empowered to do. The Articles of Confederation required that any amendments proposed would be ratified unanimously by the legislatures of all 13 states, meaning 13 votes. I don't mean it have to be unanimously in each legislature, but it had to be unanimous among the 13 states. The Constitutional Convention convened. They threw out the Articles of Confederation completely. They came up with a new and better form of government, probably the best ever devised by man, and they changed the mode of ratification, and they changed the numbers required. They changed from ratification by state legislatures to ratification by state ratifying conventions, because they felt a lot of the states would not ratify, and they required only 3/4 of the states instead of all 13 to ratify. Now, the results were wonderful. We enjoy one of the finest governments on the face of the earth, the finest form of government, but they set some dangerous precedents. First, they set the precedent that a constitutional convention is sovereign and can set its own limitations and can do whatever it pleases. Second, that they can change the method of ratification and the numbers required for ratification. So with that in mind, the idea of limiting a constitutional convention is a very, very risky business, to say the least. Now, is this just my opinion? Well, let me share with you. This is a list of just a few of the prominent legal scholars from all kinds of universities that do not believe that a constitutional convention can be limited to one subject. I'm going to just hit their names. First is T. Alexander Alenkoff, University of Michigan Law School, professor of law, by the way. Florian Bartosik, University of California at Davis School of Law, Charles L. Black, Sterling Professor, Yale Law School, C. Christopher Brown, University of Maryland School of Law, Neil Cogan, Southern Methodist University School of Law, Walter E. Dellinger, Duke University School of Law, Thomas I. Emerson, Yale Law School, Jefferson B. Fordham, University of Utah College of Law, Gerald Gunther, Stanford Law School, Betsy Levine, Dean, University of Colorado School of Law, Arvil A. Morris, University of Washington School of Law, William Overgaard, Professor of Public Law, Boise State University, Charles E. Rice, Notre Dame Law School. He's currently the Dean of Notre Dame. He's also a member of the John Birch Society, and he's a former Professor of Constitutional Law. Terrence Sandalow, Dean, University of Michigan Law School, Phyllis Schlafly, President of the Eagle Forum, Robert L. Schwartz, University of New Mexico School of Law, Lawrence H. Tribe, Harvard University Law School, and I have from each one of them a letter stating their position. This is from Charles E. Rice. Each one of these that I have listed, I have a letter from them stating their legal opinion that you cannot limit a constitutional convention. Now, what about other sources, other comments on that particular subject? Well, in July of 1985, in fact, July 31st of 1985 to be specific, the United States House of Representatives Subcommittee on Civil and Constitutional Rights, which is a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, held hearings on a constitutional convention, and they came to this conclusion. Now, I'm going to have to back up. I don't want to read the whole hearing, but they examined the fact that most of the states that had issued calls for constitutional conventions had put limitations and said that their call was not to be counted if the convention could not be limited. And they took an examination of the state of Delaware, to be very specific, and Delaware was rather emphatic that they didn't want to be counted as calling for a constitutional convention unless it could be limited. Well, Orrin Hatch testified before the committee. He says, quote, "To the extent that a petition was required to be precise, whether with respect to the specific amendment sought or the specific language sought, there would be little use for the convention itself. To limit the convention to the consideration of a single, meticulously worded amendment is to make the convention a farce." In other words, what they're saying is, if they're going to have a convention, they're going to have a convention. They're not going to try to limit it to what every little legislature, what all 34 legislatures are trying to say. Now, Delaware was very specific as to exactly what they wanted in a convention, and the conclusion, after the study of the committee, was, quote, "This statement by the legislature is mere opinion, not a part of its call, and it must be disregarded since the nature of any convention is such as to require deliberation and drafting. It is a statement which is surplusage, not a condition invalidating the call by Delaware." I think they're pretty clear on that. It says the similar but less explicit language of other states must be regarded as legislative opinion without binding force. So when you talk to your state representatives, I guarantee you, you will hear that particular line that, we've guaranteed it, nothing's going to happen, we're okay, because we've said that this call will not be valid unless, it's passed on Tuesday with particular limitations. Now, I think it's important also to look at what the Founding Fathers had to say about it. In the Constitution, it's clear you cannot limit a convention. James Madison commented about constitutional conventions. He says, quote, "Having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under every propitious circumstance, I should tremble for the result of a second." So if you don't remember anything else I've said tonight, remember this, that there is no way you can limit the constitutional convention. Once that convention is called, the game is up. You and I will have virtually no input on it. There is no guarantee that it'll come back to the state legislatures. In fact, even the Constitution that we have today was ratified by state ratifying conventions, and even one of the amendments. I've talked to some state legislators who said, oh, well, that could never happen. It's never happened before. But if you look at, I believe it's the 21st Amendment. Yes, the 21st Amendment. This is the one repealing prohibition. The Congress knew that they could never get that amendment through the state legislatures. So if you look at the 21st Amendment, Section 3, it says, "The article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by conventions in the several states as provided in the Constitution within 7 years from the date of submission hereof to the states by the Congress." Now, The bottom line is, you can't control it, you don't get a second shot. And a lot of legislators are saying, oh, we don't care. If there's anything bad comes out of this, if these CCS proposals come up, we will just reject them when it comes back to the legislature. There is no second chance. So, I think it's a very, very important point to keep in mind. Now, let's talk, most important of all, about solutions. Let's shift gears a little bit. Where do we want to go? What do we want to do? It's one thing to know that you've got a group of people conspiring to destroy your form of government, and that they've got specific proposals. And they make no bones about it. They say that if a constitutional convention is called, they will be ready. They've done their homework. They mean business. Well, so do we. So do we. And the bottom line is this. There is no public consensus for rewriting the Constitution of the United States. There is a great deal of public ignorance and apathy. Most people are not aware that there's even such a proposal. So if you can inform people, the game is over. Let me give you a specific example. In March 1987, the House of Representatives in the state of Montana passed a call for a constitutional convention. Nearly 2/3 of the senators in that state were co-sponsors on a bill calling for a constitutional convention. It looked as though there was no possibility of stopping it. Here it cleared the House. 2/3 of the senators were sponsors. How do you stop something like that? Well, 2 members of the society from Maryland went out to Montana. I helped them put this flyer together, and they stapled it to 50,000 copies of this little reprint entitled The Bicentennial Plot. Subtitle, A Scheme Exists to Turn the Founders Upside Down. You can probably see this flyer. Let me read it to you. It has big bold print at the top. It says, urgent information. Do you know that the United States is now on the brink of being plunged into a constitutional convention should the Montana and New Jersey legislatures finalize their pending calls for one? At that point, the United States Constitution would be up for grabs and open to any and all changes unless you stop them. Do you know that the Montana State House of Representatives voted for a constitutional convention and that the State Senate has scheduled hearings for Monday, March 16, 1987 at 10 a.m. to consider H.J.R. 10 calling for a constitutional convention? Do you know that there is no way to limit a constitutional convention? Constitutional conventions are by their very self-definition sovereign bodies. As President Reagan has stated, quote, well, constitutional conventions are prescribed as a last resort because once it's open, they could take up any number of things, and we document that, quote. Do you know, plans have been made to add a package of 12 constitutional amendments should a convention be called. The attached article describes how these amendments will permanently alter our form of government and cost you your freedom. What you can do, don't let anyone tamper with the United States Constitution. 1, read the attached article. 2, call, write, or visit the members of the State Senate and State Administration Committee immediately, and then here we give you their names and phone numbers. Well, two people organized the distribution of 50,000 copies of this flyer stapled to this reprint in 10 days. Now, obviously, they didn't do it alone. They worked with every conceivable group they could find. They worked with church groups of every denomination, with union groups, Boy Scout troops, Christian schools, farm organizations. They blanketed the state of Montana. Montana has fewer than 500,000 people. The net result was that on Monday, March 16, 1987, more than 1,000 irate citizens turned out at that hearing. They packed the Senate gallery. They filled it up. They allowed people to sit and stand along the aisles. Everyone was instructed to be quiet. Unless they were a scheduled speaker, there was to be no applause, no comments from the floor, that they could be there as observers only. Well, the first half of the testimony was all given by those who were in favor of having a constitutional convention. The first speaker was a professor who got up and structured his speech, had a very eloquent speech in favor of a convention, and he divided it into 3 portions. In the first portion, he ended by saying that anyone that believed that there was a plot to rewrite the U.S. Constitution was foolish. And he closed the second third of his speech by saying that anyone that believed that there was a plot to rewrite the Constitution was ignorant. And he wrapped his speech up by saying that anyone that believed there was a plot to rewrite the U.S. Constitution was paranoid. And with that, my friend from Maryland said a big, tall Montana rancher sitting next to him reached over and hit him in the ribs with his elbow, and he said, hey, buddy, he says, you know you're sitting next to somebody that's foolish, ignorant, and paranoid? Well, the tide began to turn at that hearing when the first speaker that opposed the Constitutional Convention got up to speak. It was United States Senator Daniel Evans from the state of Washington, and he introduced himself by saying, I'm U.S. Senator Daniel Evans from the state of Washington, and I'm paranoid. With that, the House came down. People applauded, they whistled, they screamed, they stamped their feet, they hollered, and from that point on, every speaker was applauded and cheered. The Senate took an immediate vote. The vote was 45-4 against the call for a constitutional convention. Now bear in mind, 2/3 of the men casting those votes had their names on as sponsors of that bill. This shows you what education can do. Was this an isolated case? Not at all. We've had similar results in Ohio, Kentucky, New Jersey, Wisconsin, California, Washington. A few other places we tried to do. Now these are stopping fresh calls. You might think, well, golly, a little handful of CCS members, something the public's not for, that should be easy. You would not believe the pressure that is brought to bear upon these state legislators when push comes to shove. In the state of Nevada, key members of a Senate committee that were instrumental in blocking the call for the withdrawal of Nevada's call for a constitutional convention were all given gold presidential cufflinks from President Reagan. In New Hampshire, we worked very, very hard and had enough votes lined up in both the House and the Senate to pass a bill withdrawing New Hampshire's call for a constitutional convention. It passed the House. It went to the Senate. It was very, very close. There were eloquent speeches, pro and con. And one particular Democratic senator, who was solidly in our camp, or so we thought, was getting up every day giving very eloquent speeches defending the Constitution and opposing the call for a constitutional convention. Well, Vice President Bush flew into the state and personally pressured Governor Sununu and certain members of the legislature. Bob Dole made phone calls to key members of the Senate and also to President Sununu. And we didn't know for sure, and we can't prove it to this day, but we suspect some kind of a deal was worked out because the day of the vote, that key Democratic senator suddenly switched his position. And his reversal was so dramatic that some of the Republicans who were opposed to the Constitutional Convention got up on the floor of the Senate and began quoting his speeches from the day before and 2 days before and a week before, saying, Senator, you know, yesterday you said da-da-da-da, and last week you said da-da-da-da, and we thoroughly agree. Well, they took a vote. It was a tie vote, which was a loss for us. You can't win on a tie vote. We lost, and the very next day, Governor Sununu appointed that man's son to the highest paid appointed position in the state of New Hampshire. Coincidence? A Republican governor appointing a Democrat to the highest paid appointed position in the state? Maybe. We don't think so. Governor Sununu, who shortly thereafter appointed his White House chief of staff. Coincidence? We don't know. But we find this kind of pressure being brought to bear every place that we get involved. In fact, one of our members in the Carlisle area went to visit his state representative. In fact, I can expand on that to give you an idea as to what can be done about this. He went to visit his state representative to ask him to sponsor legislation to withdraw Pennsylvania's call for a constitutional convention, which, by the way, we have been successful in that regard. We have legislation sponsored in both the House and the Senate. It hasn't passed yet. We got it through the House in the last session, and we're going to try to get it through the House and Senate this session. But anyway, he went to visit his representative, and his representative sent a follow-up letter, kind of as a courtesy, acknowledging his visit. And he stated in the follow-up letter, he said, "You are the only person from within my district that has ever contacted me on this subject, pro or con." He said, "I've received a great deal of pressure from outside the state, but you're the only constituent that has ever made a comment on this particular issue." I think that's a rather revealing comment. Well, what else? What can you do about it? We've shown that education works. You put the material before the public, you bring these proposals to a screeching halt. So what kinds of things have we been doing? In states that have not issued a call, we've been using the same flyer. We scratch out Montana and New Jersey, and we stick in Wisconsin and Ohio, or Wisconsin and Kentucky, or Michigan and Kentucky, whatever states we need. We change the Senate members down here. We put the appropriate names, maybe change the date, and we use the same flyer and the same literature, and we get the same results. That's great for stopping new calls. How about getting rid of existing calls? Now, here in New York, you need to concentrate on preventing a fresh call. That's the most dangerous thing we can deal with. The reason being is that there is some area of debate as to the validity of withdrawals. I think they're valid because I'm working for them. But we don't want to have any debate on this issue. When we're talking about preserving our freedom, it's not a room for taking chances. We continue in states like Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, etc., to try to withdraw the existing calls for two reasons. First, they may be valid. Maybe the withdrawals are valid, in which case now, instead of there being 32 states, there are only 29 states that have issued calls because of withdrawals that we've achieved. Second, in order to get a withdrawal, the only way you can do it is to educate the public and cause a fuss. I mean, you really have to stir up a ruckus. You've got to let the legislators know that if they want to return to their cushy jobs in Harrisburg and elsewhere, Albany in your case, they need to support legislation to protect the Constitution by withdrawing the calls for a constitutional convention. Now, once you've done that, the chances of getting a fresh call are virtually nil. Some people are afraid that the calls are too old. Some of these calls are going to need to be refreshing. The CCS people have worked on proposals to get around that. Early in 1989, about this time last year, you may remember that Congress passed a mammoth pay raise, and the public was outraged. Well, a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange, sent out a package to members in all of the 50 states asking them to introduce immediate legislation condemning the pay raise and calling for a constitutional convention as a way of hampering Congress. That's, again, like throwing the foxes into the henhouse as a way of punishing them. It didn't get off the ground because the Congress backed off. The pay raise thing kind of flopped. But they're trying to get some hot emotional issue to get a fresh call. Now, if a state has just withdrawn its call after a knockdown, drag-out battle, what do you think the chances are of getting a fresh call? They're like zip. So that's why we want to work on this, whether these withdrawals are valid or not. And I'm of the opinion that they are. So what have we done? Well, we've put together petitions similar to this one. This one happens to be from Virginia. If it happened to be from Pennsylvania, the only way you'd know is by looking at the names of the representatives, and we would say Pennsylvania instead of Virginia. We're using the same type of petition all across the country. It is a one-signature petition, just one name. It comes back to us. This one comes back to one of our members on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, so that we can build a database of people who care about the Constitution, so that we can send out a postcard and say, hey, this bill is in a such and such a committee, pick up the phone right away and call. We're putting together an organization. The net result is that in states like Florida and Alabama, we have successfully achieved the goal of withdrawing the call for a constitutional convention. In Nevada, we caused such a fuss, the House of Representatives passed it several times, but we couldn't get it through the Senate because of those gold cufflinks that I told you about. Well, what happened? The state of Nevada, the House of Representatives, decided to do one better. They looked at this issue and they felt that they had been defrauded because they had been told that a constitutional convention could be limited to a balanced budget amendment, which it cannot. So they did one better than withdrawing. They expunged their call. This is the actual resolution. It passed unanimously. There was not one dissenting vote. Let me take the time to share it with you. It's kind of interesting. I won't give you the numbers and all that, but it says, whereas the original support by Nevada for requesting the Congress of the United States to call a constitutional convention was based upon the representation that the convention would be limited to proposing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America, and whereas the Constitution of the United States does not provide for a constitutional convention to be restricted to a single subject, and whereas the Constitution of the United States does not need to be changed in order to balance the budget of the United States, but the existing provisions which limit the expenditures to those purposes authorized by the states when they agreed to the Constitution of the United States need to be enforced, and whereas the adoption by the Nevada legislature of Senate Joint Resolution number 8 of the 60th session of the legislature, file number 39, requesting the Congress of the United States to call a constitutional convention was therefore induced by fraud. Whereas fraud colors everything it touches, and that phrase is in quotes, and the appropriate remedy is for the Assembly to expunge from its journal its passage of Senate Joint Resolution number 8 of the 60th session of the legislature requesting the Congress of the United States to call a constitutional convention. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Assembly of the State of Nevada that the chief clerk of the Assembly draw a black border around that portion of the 1979 Assembly Journal record whereby the Assembly passed Senate Joint Resolution number 8 and right across the face thereof expunged by the order of the Assembly this 24th day of June, 1989, and be it further resolved that certified copies of this resolution, together with the expunged portion of the Assembly Journal, be forwarded to the governor of the state of Nevada, the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States of America, the Vice President of the United States as President of the Senate, and to the Nevada congressional delegation. Now that is the kind of results that we need to let people know where we're going. So clearly, our Constitution is in serious jeopardy. What we're seeing is part of a long-term plan to build a new world order. There are several things that you need to do. One, we have a packet called our no-con kit, which includes some of the materials that I've shared with you, the list of legal authorities that oppose the Constitutional Convention, and a package of instructions. In fact, it's a no-con kit. Specific step-by-step instructions showing you what to do to stop a Constitutional Convention. It's got information in it, such as which states have passed and which have not, etc. Lays out point by point what you need to do. But the key in every case is information and education in the hands of the voters. The other thing is to become informed of the bigger part of the problem, because a Constitutional Convention and rewriting and changing our form of government would greatly facilitate the drive for a one-world superstate, would greatly facilitate the merger of the United States with totalitarian systems. But that's not to guarantee that they can't do it without those changes. We've got to stop the merger. We've got to work for our independence. Ed Clements left a flyer and a little brochure up here and a bumper sticker up here. It says, "Not world government, keep us independent." Got a little reprint by Gary Benoit. I wish I had the time to go into this topic tonight, but we don't. It's entitled, "Keep Us Independent." Not globalism, not world government, not interdependence, but independence. These are available at the back literature table, the bumper stickers and the flyer. If you're not familiar with the topic, I'd highly recommend that you get hold of it. I'd also recommend that you take a look at the bigger problem. This is one of the best books that I've read in probably a decade. Shadows of Power, subtitled "The Council on Foreign Relations in the American Decline." This is about the organization that is working to destroy the sovereignty of the United States of America. This book, I've had tremendous results with everybody that has read this. I don't think anybody can read this book that isn't brain dead and not be affected by it. I had a rather interesting encounter about this time last year. I had a Birch meeting in the home of a young man up in State College, Pennsylvania. He's working on a doctorate in molecular biology up at State College. And he invited half a dozen or so friends to come to a Birch presentation to find out what the Birch Society was all about. And one young man was working on his doctorate in political science. And to be quite frank, he was a pain in the butt. Hope that language doesn't offend anybody, but he really was. He thought he knew everything there was to know. He was constantly interrupting with his little gems of wisdom. And I was determined that before that night was over, if I had to break his arm, I was going to get him to buy this book. It's only $10.95. I thought, man, that guy's not getting out of this door without a copy of that book. And I wasn't inclined to give it to him. So I started hammering away and hammering away. Well, finally he gave in and agreed to buy the book. But he said, well, I'll buy it, but I'll never read it. I'm much too busy for that kind of material. Well, it was a Friday night. He went home, and Saturday morning he picked this book up, and he read it cover to cover. He didn't stop until it was finished. He ran into the Bircher that hosted the meeting on Sunday, and he was almost in a state of shock. He said he learned more in one day reading this book than in all the political science courses he'd taken at Penn State. And he said, where have I been all my life? This book did more to shake him up and inform him than anything he'd come across. If you haven't read it, there are oodles of copies at the back. I highly recommend it. You are depriving yourself of some very valuable information. Probably give you a better understanding of what's happening in the world today than anything you can get your hands on. But that's not enough. We need to get this book into the hands of influence leaders all across the country. And to do that, the John Birch Society has put together a program called the Power Project. And what we're doing is sending this book to every member of every state legislature in all 50 states. We're talking, what is the number, 3,000, 3,500? It's a pretty big number. We're also putting it in virtually every public library and every secondary school and college library in America. and putting it in the hands of influence leaders all over the country. Now you may be thinking, well, do they read it? Well, of course not. Not all of them do, but some of them do. In fact, I have a lead in my lead file for Washington, D.C., a young man that's an aide. In fact, he's an administrative assistant to one of the congressmen. The book was sent to the congressman. The congressman never saw it, but he read it. And now he wants to join the John Birch Society. And as soon as I get back home and get a chance, I'm going to run down to Washington, D.C. and sign him up. But that's the kind of results that we're getting. In some cases, the people that we send it to are not the ones reading it, but their staff, the congressional staff. We've hit the entire Congress and Senate. We're working state by state. Now, if you look in your bulletin of the John Birch Society, they give you a rundown each month of how your state's doing. Let me just look here. New York, you've got 211 representatives and senators in the state legislature, and 58% of them are funded. In other words, we have the money to pay for 58%. 40% of the books are actually shipped. Now that is, I'm looking at the January bulletin. The February bulletin just came out, and I'm sure those numbers have increased substantially. But we need help. For $15, we can put this book into the hands of a state legislator. So if you want to help, if you can give us, say, $150, we'll hit 10 legislators or libraries or what have you. It's an extremely important project. We've got to get that information out to people, and we need your help. We need your help in getting in touch with your representatives and senators here in Albany, in the state legislature. I'd like to leave you with a closing thought. We need help in the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society is extremely effective, but very, very small. It's not a mass movement. It's a tiny handful of people who are effective because they've got powerful information. Do we have any applications for membership at the back table?
We have to have some.
Could you spread them around? I know there are members and non-members. I don't know who's who. I live in Pennsylvania. But if we're going to turn this situation around, we need all the help we can get. We have two kinds of members in the John Birch Society because we know it's an organization of individuals. It's an organization of free people, and free people do what they want to do. For people who are too busy to actively participate but want to help, we have what we call home chapter membership. That's like membership at large. Members of the home chapter receive the literature, they receive the notices, the speeches, the meetings, and what have you. If they can come out, wonderful. If they can't, that's fine too. But then for those that are really serious and whose time allows, we have active local chapters. If you look at the application, you'll notice that there are two types of membership. I'd highly encourage you to consider one of the two types. If you can get involved and take an active role in working to preserve your own freedom and to prevent the loss of our national sovereignty, to prevent the destruction of our country, if you can get actively involved, join a local chapter. If you want to help but don't have the time, join the home chapter and thus become a sponsor of our activity. I'd like to leave you with a closing thought from Samuel Adams, 1775, on the brink of the American Revolution. And we need your help, but this kind of summarizes my feeling. He says, if you love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. We ask not your counsel or arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chain set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that you were our countrymen. Sam Adams, 1775. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. No, there's no stated time limit in any of the calls, and that is a subject of debate among scholars as to just how long is a reasonable length of time. Some of the original calls were back in the mid-70s, 76, I believe was the first, and there is some question as to whether that call is valid or not. This is why I mentioned earlier that there's an attempt to get fresh calls, and this is why we want to get those calls withdrawn, even the ones that are in question, because if we can succeed to get a legislature to withdraw its call, they're not likely to issue a fresh call. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Yes? No, that was only the House of Representatives. And again, if you're talking about legality, it's a gigantic question mark. I think it makes it pretty clear where they stand, and they feel that if they've expunged it, now it has no longer cleared both houses. But the Senate was the gold cufflinks and all that. Well, that was the problem there, and that's why they used that particular method. Any other questions? Yes.
The man in New Hampshire, what was his name, the Democratic senator?
I'd have to look it up for you. I don't.
What was the highest paid job that his son
The
got?
Fish and Game Commissioner.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
If, unfortunately, by some stroke of bad luck, we lose the next two states, and they begin the march, is there any safety valve that can stop it? Because obviously the Nevada thing is in question, and was it Alabama?
Alabama and Florida have both withdrawn.
Is there anything that we can do if this thing?
I think at that time the only thing you can do is work to create a tremendous groundswell of public opposition, because there are a lot of legal arguments as to why none of these calls are valid. The whole idea that all the calls, not all of them, but the majority of them put restrictions on a convention which is not valid. A lot of them state in their call that the call is not valid if the Constitutional Convention is called for any purpose other than balancing the budget. The only thing that can stop it at that point is a massive outpouring of public opposition, and then you'd have some heroic politician getting up and doing some move to stop it. I would not count on that. That's not a very safe ground, because you'd have the whole media, ABC, NBC, CBS, etc., pushing, and it would be the perfect time for the crisis. You follow what I'm saying? And if you don't think that an artificial crisis couldn't be tripped off like that, any other questions? Yes. Well, it is. You actually need 4 and possibly 5. If you count Alabama and Florida's withdrawal, they need 4 states, and if you count Nevada, they need 5. We're safer than we were. Again, there could be some leaks in the lifeboat, but we're a little bit safer. Any other questions? Yes.
What sort of people do you think would populate the convention?
These folks. You want me to read you who I think will be on the convention? The list is right here. This is the list. In fact, the fellow that I quoted earlier, in A New Constitution Now, Henry Hazlitt, in his book, he recommends that the Congress declare itself to be the convention. Now that's incredible when you consider that their big argument is that Congress is out of control. And one of them actually proposes that the Congress itself declares, and there's no guideline. There's absolutely no guideline. At this point, it's an open question.
One question more on Article 5 of the Constitution, where you said if 3/4 of the states, 2/3 of the states call for a convention, it says the Congress then shall call a convention. Could they refuse to call a convention? Could they ignore it?
The only way they could do that is to declare some of the calls invalid, because they're basically required. In other words, it says basically they shall call a convention on the application. The only thing that they could do would be to attempt to invalidate some of the calls. The problem is the pressure from both the Democratic and Republican National Committee, from the news media, from the entire establishment, is for a convention. So again, let me put it this way. I'm not one to give up. Okay? If your house is on fire and you find yourself trapped, you might have to jump out the window, you might have to climb down the rain spout, but when everything looks like it's hopeless, you're going to look for another way out. And if it gets to that point, we will be looking for other ways. We will be trying to pressure Congress, we'll be trying to get calls invalidated, but the point is we don't want to get to the point where we're trapped in a room on the 3rd floor of a burning wooden house. And that's where we're headed. The deception that these people use is incredible. The National Taxpayers Union gives to legislators to send out to people that write a little thing called Question and Answers about the Balanced Budget Campaign. And I've quoted for you James Madison and others. Let me read a question. It says, if a constitutional convention is called, wouldn't it be free to tamper with other parts of the Constitution? And this is their answer. The Founding Fathers intended, that's an interesting statement, that limited conventions be called to correct specific defects in the federal Constitution. Now, if you recall what I just quoted from James Madison earlier, where James Madison talks about the dangers of a constitutional convention, that doesn't quite seem to fit with what they're saying. But let me read on. It says, almost all constitutional scholars, including former Senator Sam Ervin and the American Bar Association, agree. I just read you a whole list of the top constitutional scholars in the country that don't agree. If a constitutional convention is held, it will only have the authority to deal with a balanced budget amendment. Further, there's an additional protection. Whatever amendment emerges from the convention will have to go back to the state legislatures to be ratified by 3/4 of the states before becoming law. And as you read in your Constitution, that is not true either. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
Can't the state pass an amendment without calling the Constitutional Convention?
No, they do not have that power. They don't have that vehicle. That has been tried. In fact, several years ago, the John Birch Society was involved with another organization in pushing a thing called the Liberty Amendment, which was basically repeal the 16th Amendment. It was a constitutional amendment to abolish the graduated income tax. And the proposal passed 23 state legislatures. But unless an absolutely identical bill passed the Congress, let's say those ratifications of a non-existent amendment would have been absolutely worthless and meaningless. It did express a strong sense of those states that they didn't particularly like the graduated income tax, but there is no vehicle, unfortunately. The entire amendment procedure is summed up in Article 5. It's the only part of the Constitution that covers this, and it's rather specific. Any other questions? Yes?
Just a comment. It seems to me that if a constitutional convention was convened, that we would have no government or anything at that, because they would wipe everything out. Is that correct?
Well, you would have a government in the transition. The Articles of Confederation continued to rule until the new form of government took over, and until a new government.
You have no control in that situation.
A constitutional convention is a sovereign body. Yeah, exactly. There's someone in the middle here had a question. Yes?
I got the sense that you were saying that states that have recalled the call, some question about the legality of their recall.
Well, let me put it this way. Those that are advocating a constitutional convention certainly question the legality. It is our contention that you need a consensus. You need 3/4 of the states. You need 34 states to issue a call simultaneously, or reasonably within a period that would consist of a consensus. That when you have a withdrawal, before you get that number, you do not have a consensus any longer. Again, this would, if it came into question, if we got those 2 additional states, it might end up before the Congress or before the courts or some other body. But at this point, we're going to go ahead as though those calls are valid.
I don't understand why a recall isn't just as legally called.
Oh, I agree, 100%. I agree with you 200%. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a little bit different. You may remember that some states withdrew their ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. And there was a great debate on that. And of course, the thing died, and those withdrawals were not of that great a consequence in the final analysis. But there is a difference between something coming out for approval, being stamped with approval, and a request for something that has not yet been fulfilled. You know, they're two different games entirely. And there are a number of legal scholars that believe the withdrawals are valid. Any other questions? Yes?
Where does the Bush administration stand on this issue?
The Bush administration is moving heaven and earth to get a constitutional convention called. As I mentioned, with payoffs in New Hampshire and political pressure, phone calls, etc. In fact, I don't know if you're a member of the John Birch Society, but if you get hold of a February bulletin for the John Birch Society, it outlines some of the recent pressure that the Bush administration has put on state legislatures back under the Protecting the Constitution section. Any other questions? Yes?
Is the flag burning the crisis they're going to emphasize to get this going?
I don't believe so. I think that anything where there's strong public support, they will use it to get fresh calls for a constitutional convention. When we talk about a crisis to get people to accept the changes, we're talking about a major crisis. We're talking about a collapse of the financial markets, collapse of the currency, something equivalent to the Depression of the 30s or greater. is the kind of thing that they're looking for. And they repeat this over and over again, that's the magnitude that they need. If I can dig it out without wasting too much time, I was quoting from Dick Thornburg, where he says, such a significant shift in the Constitution is unlikely to come about except as a result of a crisis, a depression comparable to that of the 30s. And there are at least a dozen other places where they call for the same thing. They say that without crisis there is going to be no change, that is the key to change. Let me see if I can... I had a couple of scraps of paper, but I pulled them out as I went through here. Well, the point is, we're talking a major crisis, not a minor one. Yes?
You mentioned that $17 trillion debt. That was your number for crisis?
You bet. And just people realizing the significance of that debt alone would be a crisis. Right now, you've got literally billions upon billions of dollars of foreign investment in this country that is here on the good faith and credit of the United States government. If that debt ever appeared to be in question, those billions of dollars would disappear overnight. That would be a crisis of unbelievable proportions. The point is, there's going to be a crisis, because when you reach a situation where you're borrowing to pay the interest on your borrowings, you're in serious trouble. That's like spending so much money that you have to take your Visa card and get cash advances to make payments on your MasterCard, and then you get a home equity loan to pay on both, and you're borrowing more money to pay the interest. The country financially is in deep trouble. The solution is in Congress. And unless we get control of the Congress, we've got some real serious problems on our hands. Was there another question? If not, I'd like to just disagree with one thing that Ed said. He said that if you wanted to join, you could take your application home and sleep on it and think about it and come visit a few meetings. Personally, I took 6 months to join the John Birch Society, I'm ashamed to say. I had to read all the books and see all the films and hear the speakers and come to meetings. If everybody does that, it'll take too long. We simply are not going to save a country if we keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. We are at a crisis stage now. We need your help. We need your support today. If you want to save your freedom, if you want to save your way of life, if you want to stop the destruction of our educational system, the destruction of our values, the debauching of our currency, the bleeding off of our investment capital, the destruction of our cities, it's got to start today. We really don't have time. We are running out of time. We need help, and we need it now. Thank you.